Environmental Studies Department. Thanks for being here through the entire day. It's a beautiful afternoon. It's my pleasure to just introduce our speakers for this last session. It's called Sustaining Development or Building Equity, Compensating the Vulnerable Poor for Climate Change. And I'm just going to cut my introductory remarks because I think that last session was plenty provocative and gets us ready for the same kinds of topics we'll be talking about here. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Kathy McAfee from the International Relations Department at San Francisco State. I was introduced to Kathy's work on market approaches to conservation when I first came to UCSC about 5 years ago, and it's a real pleasure to have her here today talking a little bit about market approaches to climate change. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we were asked to not do PowerPoint, so I'm not doing PowerPoint. I'm unfortunately reading off my screen, but I think it'll work. In the abstract for the workshop that Adam sent to us, he said, this session will critically evaluate such models as paying off the poor. Do they reflect another shift in development discourse that merely reinforces old inequalities? And he gave us some examples, the Rio framework and carbon sequestration programs and markets. So that's what I'll talk about. I want to talk about the Rio, the Earth Summit deals. The original Rio in 1992, which was meant to enroll the Global South in confronting these recently discovered global environmental problems, global in quotes. And you know, it was definitely had the idea of enrolling the Global South, otherwise it wouldn't have been a conference on sustainable development, it would have been a conference on environment. But it was at the insistence of the Global South states that it became sustainable development. So the key premises in the 1992 deal, some were stated explicitly. One was that economic growth, implicitly capitalist economic growth, is compatible with solving global environmental problems with basically no major sacrifices by anybody. Another premise was that humanity has a common interest in doing this, but third premise, the Global South needs help to do its share. So this is reflected in the treaties that followed the Earth Summit, the framework, the Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity, where you see this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities built in to some extent in these treaties. So basically the North, the Global North, promises to pay for conservation. The industrializing South gets a grace period, say no targets in the first round of the Kyoto Protocol, which may be the only round. But, another part of this was that benefits that were to be derived from the newly recognized values of nature can be shared with the Global South. So this concept of benefit sharing emerged in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and specifically through this new transnational market in so-called genetic resources, another example of this course being created to do certain tasks. So genetic resources recently invented, and the idea was that in effect, that the South would-be developing countries would get development aid in the form of a share of the benefits from the commercial utilization of biodiversity. That's the specific language. It's one of the three main pillars of the biodiversity treaty. So basically what you're seeing is exports of this newly valuable tropical commodity were expected to earn funds and provide incentives for conservation and funds for development. So already you see this notion of the commodification of nature applied as a development strategy, what I've called conservation by commercialization, or I have a sort of greatest hits article that a lot of people have read called Selling Nature to Save It. So back in 1992, states were still seen as the primary actors in environmental solutions, but markets, private, for-profit actors had started to make an appearance. So if we fast forward to today, as weak as the 1992 Rio deal was, it probably wouldn't be achievable today, now that we have experienced 2 decades of even more intensified worldwide economic competition backed by and enforced through neoliberal doctrine of what some people call free trade, but it's really forced trade. And during the same time, development has dropped from the global agenda and in favor of policies of trade not aid, policies for would-be industrializing countries to export their way out of poverty by opening up to even further to foreign investment and so on. So, and in the same 2 decades, we've seen a lot of elaboration of the discourse and practices for commodification of nature. Commodification both of the positive values of nature, but also the costs and damages to nature, of lack of nature. For example, what this boils down to is the ecological modernization that Dustin mentioned, internalizing environmental externalities by tweaking and prodding markets to enable growing through greening or profiting through greening. And to do this requires parsing and quantifying the multiple components and aspects of nature, extracting them from their eco-social context, ascribing to them values in terms of market prices, usually dollar prices, enforcing and creating new forms of property rights to those assets. And notice here that mainstream elitist conservationism and neoclassical economics are what you might call natural allies in such a process. Because both mainstream conservationism and neoclassical economics pivot on the notion of scarcity. Conservationists say, oh, we're running out of species, we're running out of water, we're running out of the kinds of nature we desire, humanity desires. Neoclassical economics, well, I mean, the whole foundation of neoclassical economics is the presumption of scarcity. Things are valuable in mainstream economics because they're desired and are scarce. Otherwise, they have no value. So we see this alliance rise to prominence in the concept of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are what nature does for society. And as it's turned out, ecosystem services are devilishly hard to quantify on the ground or even in the air, as it turns out. Yet conceptually, ecosystem services are ideally amenable to commodification. In fact, that's why they were invented. The inventors of ecosystem services originally saw this, and the people who first started quantifying the total value of nature on Earth saw this mainly as a heuristic tool. And we can't persuade people any other way. We'll show them how much nature is worth in dollars. But it's been applied to so-called sustainable development policy over the past decade or so in projects for payment for environmental services, or as you said, paying for, where's Adam? Yeah, as you said in the, paying off the poor. So basically, it's paying those who own or control lands, including the poor, and in some versions especially the poor, to not do things, to not deforest, to not muddy the waters with their cattle, to plant trees instead of food, as the example that Matthew mentioned in Mexico. Now, there are different versions of PES, but of the main ones, I think there are 2 kind of competing versions. One I call the compensation narrative, which involves at least partial public payment for public goods for social as well as environmental goals. That's not the dominant one. The dominant one, though, is market efficiency. Profit-motivated private choices, which, according to the logic of neoclassical economics, will lead to the optimal use of scarce conservation resources worldwide. Scarcity is key there. But common to both versions, with a few important exceptions that maybe we'll have time to talk about, the poor, small farmers, indigenous groups have no productive role in development strategy. They're obsolete, except for perhaps their cultural value to society, national or global society, or as objects of charity. Now then we see red. We see red plus and the red readiness plans that Ashwini mentioned a bit ago. And there we basically have PES on steroids. And similarly, in the case of ecosystem services, there are 2 main versions of red and red plus, which pretty much parallel the 2 main versions of PES. One is a compensation version, which is supported by some international governments and other actors, which calls for financing red through public investments by means of trusts and states and multilateral agencies for a variety of goals. But the dominant one, again, is the market-driven model, motivated by rational private choices in search of profits, in search of those returns of greater than 0% that Ron mentioned this morning. And of course, as you might suspect, this is the version preferred by the World Bank. It's the version that Goldman Sachs, to see the usual suspects appearing again, Goldman Sachs is literally banking on. They're involved in speculation in carbon credit markets. Now, after 12 years of PES in practice, and I can send you some of my own articles and other people's that show this, there's no evidence of any significant, if any at all, net environmental gains. But there is ample evidence that the use of market efficiency criteria in project design, the criteria for who gets paid and how much and for doing what, is leading to increased inequality in, and the redistribution of risk, as Matthew mentioned, from the rich to the poor. And I think this was entirely predictable, and many people did predict it, because the market-based model for ecosystem services programs makes it inevitable. And if we have time, or if you're interested, I can talk more about why that is, the role of opportunity costs and so on. And I think because of this same model being at the core of the strategy of red or red plus, we can basically expect the same thing. But to face up to these facts would call into question those three premises that have framed both of the Rio deals, the Rio plus 20 as well as the original one, and have shaped global environmental policy for the past 20 years. That capitalist growth can be sustainable, and that humanity or society has a common interest in doing that. So what happens is that any recognition of these problems gets ignored or erased from official institutional environmental discourse. So by the time we reach Rio plus 20 last June in Brazil, the currency of conversation has become green economy. Basically, that's what I'd say is ecological modernization on a global scale, again incorporating the global south, but this time thoroughly, not just partially, by means of market mechanisms. So, but now, times have changed in more ways than one. I mean, you have the dominance of this neoliberal environmental discourse, but we also find, and I think all the controversy at Rio really illustrated this, that the premises on which the Rio deal, now the green economy formulation, is based are no longer convincing. People are much less convinced, even at government levels, that capitalist growth can be sustainable or that humanity or society has a common interest. I think that really, hello. Our earlier speaker?
Ashwini.
Ashwini, yes, thank you. Yeah, obviously he described that, sorry. All right. Okay, I already said this is evidenced by the vigorous opposition to the green economy that came out even in the lead-up negotiations to the Rio plus 20, the large number of national delegations, most prominently Bolivia and other ALBA coalition members, but also other governments, for different reasons and sometimes for quite contradictory reasons, but nevertheless really objected to the green economy as the guiding framework, and if we have time we can talk more about that. As well as, of course, the opposition from the social movements who have been describing the green economy as the new Washington consensus. The government of Bolivia and the social movements described it as a new form of colonialism. The government of Ecuador and quite a few others talked about it as neocolonialism. Okay, well, I know, this alternatives always get short shrift, and we started to talk about that a little bit in some of the previous sections, and I won't say very much because I know I'm out of time. But I'll just say just a few general points. I think alternatives have to be grounded, literally grounded, in an understanding of people and nature as creating each other, not people versus nature, which is still the prevailing underlying assumption in conventional conservationism, mainstream conservationism, and mainstream environmental economics. Or as the social movements put it, there's no ecology without equity, no equity without ecology. And I think we did see examples, or at least mention of examples this morning in relation to urban organizing, in relation to rural communities in India, the mention of Via Campesina, and there are other organizations, it's VC's member organizations and others. So, just for another example, say in agriculture, which is one of the things that I work on, you can contrast this existing trajectory of speeding, speculation in land, speculation in biomass producing resources, the land grabbing that's going on around the world, and also the green grabbing. That's a big component of that. So you have this trajectory of industrial agriculture and industrial tree plantations producing these globally traded flex crops, agrofuels, and other forms of globally traded biomass commodities, and now including carbon offsets as a major globally traded commodity. Even though the carbon market is crashing, the European governments, the World Banks are desperately trying to continue to subsidize these markets in order to, so that they can keep believing in this market-based solution. And incidentally, I mean, almost all these PES projects are actually not really markets. They're really based on subsidies, but we could talk about that later perhaps. Anyway, so if you contrast that trajectory, that model, to local production for local and national markets, using low external input agriculture, agroecology, including agroecological science with numbers and so on, but especially the local knowledge, the frozen buckets kind of knowledge. Or look at the kinds of things that communities have been doing, such as agricultural practices that sequester carbon in the soils. So you have the big agro-industry companies saying, oh, we're going to come in with this massive biochar. We're going to take even more land to grow stuff so we can burn it and bury it. And we will collect our credits from doing that. But local communities, and I really am, this is almost my next to last sentence, local communities in, for example, Africa. If you look at the Journal of Peasant Studies issue on green grabbing, which I highly recommend to people here, there's a super article on how much biochar has been built into traditional agricultural practices in West and Central Africa. So if you build on these humanity and nature making each other approaches and the ways that people help keep nature sustainable and productive for humanity and other species, then there's so much more you can do than if you just push people out of the way in favor of green grabs for huge plantations and industrial biochar and other profit-driven carbon sink schemes. That's all.
Thank you, Kathy. Our next speaker is Alex Barnard, a PhD student or candidate in the sociology department at UC Berkeley.
Okay. I'm pretty loud, so hopefully you want it.
Is that volume working? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to present today. My research is in its fairly early stages, but generally I'm interested not in the politics of climate change per se, but as you articulated earlier, sort of what kind of politics are coming out of climate change at the local level in the developing world. Looking at recent policy debates about climate change, it seems that the sticking point has become primarily one of compensation. That rather than talking about reducing emissions in the developed world, now the discourse has primarily shifted to how to pay the developing world to do it for us. And therefore, the set of questions we're asking about climate change has narrowed. How to pay developing countries for foregone carbon-intensive development, and how to ensure that the funds benefit those countries' most marginalized and vulnerable populations. But what I want to suggest briefly is that this framework of compensation may not be the right one. First of all, because the idea of simply compensating poor people for not engaging in various behaviors misses the sort of complex and original ways that these groups can contribute to and improve carbon mitigation projects. And while traditionally policymakers have assumed that the only way to achieve this participation is through some sort of promise of sustainable development, the linking of economic incentives to environmental protection, I want to point out how the novel situation and political configurations created by climate change opens up new avenues of mobilizing around environmental issues. And I want to illustrate this point by drawing very briefly on my research on Ecuador's Yasuni ITT initiative, which is an innovative carbon mitigation scheme. Ecuador is one of Latin America's largest oil producers, and the government depends on oil for 25% of its yearly revenue. Nonetheless, in 2007, the country's leftist president, Wrathall, offered what he called a pioneering initiative in the history of an oil-producing country. Ecuador pledged to leave underground nearly 1 billion barrels of oil in Yasuni National Park, which is widely thought to be one of the most biodiverse places in the world. And to offer an example, a recent study found more species of trees in 1 hectare of Yasuni Park than in all of North America. In exchange, Ecuador asked the world community for funds equal to half the oil's market value, $3.6 billion, to be deposited into a UNDP trust fund, which would in turn be used to fund sustainable development projects in the Yasuni area. The proposal immediately won accolades from world civil society, precisely because it fit in with this framework of compensation, that a developing country would give something up, in this case, the revenue from oil, and receive something in return, this money for sustainable development. My research, however, focuses on how local populations, whose abstention from activities like logging and hunting in the park were deemed crucial for the project's success, perceived the initiative, and how climate change imbricated with the local political economy in which it was just one of many different issues. In interviews and focus groups, I found profound skepticism of the motives of international donors and the Ecuadorian state. Locals doubted that money from the initiative would ever reach them. Moreover, few people trusted in this notion of sustainable development. After years in which numerous international conservation organizations had come with various failed integrated conservation and development projects, almost no one believed that they were going to be able to survive off of ecotourism or handicraft crafts production. Given these observations, we might expect that, given these observations and much of the theorizing about the social bases of environmental concern in the developing world, we might expect that most residents of the Yasuni area would oppose the initiative. Nonetheless, a poll of 600 area residents found 94% supported leaving the oil underground. And in my own research, 85% expressed the same perspective. How can we explain how so many people got behind a carbon mitigation project that, in these people's eyes, offered them no compensation and no prospects of development? And I want to emphasize 3 different framings which were used by residents themselves to explain support for the ITT initiative, particularly nationalism, regionalism, and ethnic identity. First, nationalism. When asked about the value of the park, many residents reiterated the common trope from global environmental organizations that the Amazon is, quote, the lungs of the world. Yet this did not reflect some post-materialist concern for the well-being of humanity. Instead, residents used this idea to emphasize Ecuador's distinctiveness. Because other countries had cut down their forests and destroyed their natural environments, they were now dependent upon Ecuador for oxygen. Residents stated over and over again that we are not Venezuela, reflecting an understanding that Ecuador's oil supplies were limited and therefore not sufficient to underpin national development or national identity. Instead, for them, what made Ecuador unique was its environment. Preserving the environment was thus a source of both national pride and a key linchpin for national identity. Another surprising finding from my research was that the main actor mobilizing support for preserving Yasuni was not international conservation groups or the national government. Instead, it was municipal authorities. In the past, these same authorities had clashed with the national government over the distribution of oil revenues. Now, though, they argued that the real difference between themselves and the central state was that they were the ones who wanted to leave the oil underground. Municipal authorities denounced both the central government and oil companies as part of the same unconcerned and disconnected elite, pointing to the degraded local environment as evidence. In short, the ITT initiative had become a political football used in ongoing populist mobilizations in which local governments emphasized that ordinary Amazonians, not elite state bureaucrats or conservationists, were best positioned to protect the environment. Finally, there was a dark side to this support for the ITT initiative. In the last 3 decades, a huge outpouring of research has documented the environmental campaigns of indigenous people in the Amazon seeking both respect for their cultural traditions and control of traditional territories. Far less attention has been given to the role of non-indigenous colonists who moved to the Amazon from elsewhere and constitute a majority of the region's population. In my research, I found that colonists were increasingly challenging indigenous peoples' environmental credentials. They argued that the indigenous cosmovision, which focused on the wise use of natural resources, was inappropriate for a place like Yasuni, where virtually any human activity appeared to be disruptive to a fragile ecosystem. In turn, they used their own support for the Yasuni initiative to claim that they were the true residents of the Amazon, not migrants or trespassers, and that the region's territory should belong to them. In short, for many in Yasuni, compensation for leaving the oil underground was unnecessary. Most perceived preservation of the park as intrinsically more valuable than the development that the oil companies and the state had traditionally promised them. They made this evaluation based not on their own livelihood interests or desire for development, but assertions of national, regional, and ethnic identity. Obviously, like all case studies, it's difficult to generalize from the unique configurations of social, historical, and ecological conditions swirling around Yasuni. Nonetheless, I think the example can lead us to reorient our thinking in some significant ways. First, policymakers tend to look at regions like the Amazon and see a need for both conservation and development, and then assume the two should be linked to one another. In truth, though, attempts to fuse sustainability with economic advancement often fail, something that people on the ground had long since recognized. As a result, in thinking about climate mitigation, we might think about alternative avenues through which support for these projects can be elicited, avenues that speak to the complex identities of the poor, that is not just an economic identity, but also national, ethnic, and regional identity. Secondly, I want to suggest that the notion of compensation narrows our conception of the way in which poor people can contribute to climate mitigation. Although overwhelmingly the poor of the developing world are not responsible for climate change and should not bear the burden of paying for adaptation and mitigation, we can look to them for examples of new forms of thinking about how to mobilize people to act on climate change here in the global north. Thank you.
Alex. Our third speaker will be David Kyle from the Sociology Department at UC Davis.
Wow, what great presentation. It's hard to follow. So my talk is very different today because well, first of all, it's a work in progress in the sense that I haven't really adapted the climate change narrative as my identity for very long, and I'm sure I completely do. And I'm happy to hear I don't really have to anymore, so that's great. It's kind of complicated, obviously. Actually, I want to tell you a little bit kind of about my journey as to why I'm doing what I'm doing and why I'm kind of beginning on launching a new project. I was very happy. I walked into the middle of a wonderful talk, and then Matthew made these comments about the imagination. I was thinking, wow, this is exactly where I want to be, because I actually want to talk about the imagination. Now, I was prepared to talk about something completely different, but I'm going to actually talk about my new project on the imagination. But I want to tell you how I got there. I think it's not hard for an audience like this to, why is he talking about the imagination? That doesn't make any sense. I think you can see that there's some short steps to what we're all talking about, or what I imagined you were talking about today, to talking about the imagination itself. First, my background is in international mobility and ethnic identity. I did my PhD dissertation research in Ecuador also, in 2 different regions. And it was very much about imagined communities and transnationalism. The Otavaleños, which is one of the most successful groups in Latin America, I kind of really deconstructed over 500 years, what was this identity and where did it come from and all the complexities of it. Before that, I actually worked in environmental, did a study of Belize and how Coca-Cola Foods was able to buy 1/5 of the country of Belize. And then a counter movement using the internet back then, this is the 1980s, that's how long. Actually successfully had a boycott, or at least threatened a boycott, in which Coca-Cola Foods, they were claiming it was a rainforest, which was also kind of imagined, but nonetheless successful. And Coca-Cola Foods also pulled out, but in reality they just changed their name to Beverage Services Products. This is Minute Maid orange juice. They're going to plant orange trees there. In reality, they didn't really pull out. In other words, I've had a long history of looking at things that aren't what they seem to be, and and kind of evolving over time. So I've had a kind of training to just kind of wait and see a little bit, because this too will kind of, won't really pass, but it will become transformed. Then, even more useful for this kind of approach, I started to work on human smuggling and migrant trafficking, or human trafficking. Waded into trafficking because I was talking about smuggling not as simply criminal syndicates, but as part of a neoliberal, consistent kind of swimming downstream with economic globalization, in which migration industries brokered as a kind of local development project through the local banking system, lent money in a pyramid scheme and down to the smugglers, who then brought them north, usually in a kind of mom and pop operation. Didn't look like a criminal syndicate at all. And yet, every time I've done any kind of journalistic interview for the last 10 years or so, it's always some version of, tell us how this is human cargo. And it's all just viewed as kind of it's human cargo. Trafficking had to be brought in because as I waded into it in the late 1990s, trafficking became the topic du jour. You know, it was the global moral panic. Oh my God, sex slaves. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that in terms of, you know, the kind of juggernaut issue that sort of like the Star Wars thing where they go, you know, sex slaves. And, you know, trafficking and slavery. Now, I'm not diminishing the fact that it is a fact that people are being enslaved. And by some estimates, and you know, once again, it's a world full of very large-scale estimates in which the models or the assumptions of those models of how to arrive at those estimates are a bit off-road or not really, you know, we don't really know what they are, and they change and they kind of get inflated. But the fact remains, and I'm inclined to believe it, like I believe in climate change, I do believe in climate science, that there has been a decrease in freedom by some people, but the larger point is also, I think, the point made about climate change, is it's only part of a larger trend of the decrease in freedoms of really all of us, in terms of our options and our menu and our kind of ideological positions, and I would say capturing our imaginations at a kind of fundamental level. And I became then interested, evolving out of that, in kind of more generally a mobile underclass that is not just slavery, but undocumented migrants. All of those people, and that really could be any one of us now, who get caught in a kind of legal undertow of the tension between the economic and mobility politics. Economic globalization says, you know, land, labor, and capital. It has go out and find your comparative advantage. Sell yourself. Sell each other. Sell whatever isn't nailed down. You know, commodify it. Go for it. But wait a second. No, not you. You should have to stay here, and you need multiple documents and stamps. And you know, this is, you know, that's not new. But the level of global discourse of these two things colliding is relatively new, combined with the technologies of surveillance and the long-term permanent digital records, the way laws can be kind of developed to look retrospectively at any infractions, which can then add up to what may ultimately result in deportations. So it's at this point that I'm thinking about a new research center that I've been given, which didn't have an identity. It was on population studies. Long story, a bizarre situation, but here's a research center. David, give it an identity. What should it do? So I'm thinking about this about 3 years ago, and of course I'm thinking, well, what is the future of human mobility? By the way, why does anyone need a new research center on population? And I thought, well, climate change. There seems to be something that I should look into, and I've been tracking environmental movements and climate science for a number of years, but I hadn't really applied it to my own work in international mobility. But I've been hearing more about climate refugees, and I began reading a little bit more about it. I thought, well, maybe a research center that would look at that, including the debates around it, and as a sociologist, the social construction of it, but more of an earnest kind of what is the science and how do we bridge natural sciences with the social sciences and even health sciences. Well, soon after I did that, of course, this became popular and got traction, as I predicted that it would at the time. and I think very useful. By the way, I just completed my term of that center, and the new director dropped the climate science and is now doing control of population growth. So back to an even older imaginary as well. It was in the midst of this that I gave a talk to a Malaysian delegation that was being pulled by the nose by the State Department for a 3-week tour. This is the top people in their kind of homeland security version. Malaysia state that makes Arizona look like, I don't know, Massachusetts or something. They have an army of 500,000 kind of enforcers or informers looking for undocumented migrants. The penalties are very, very severe and very few protections, and essentially sell them back across the Thai border into slavery. So this is the delegation I had in front of me, nominally to talk about sex trafficking, human smuggling, and kind of our approaches to it. I was trying out my new material on climate change with them. I thought, well, this is an opportunity to start talking about, by the way, you work in the area of refugees and migrants. So do you think about climate change or climate refugees? I wanted to see if was it even on the radar. And they looked at me like, are you crazy? We don't even know what you're talking about. We're talking about people breaking our laws. And what I have to say, one of my students, multiple piercings, everything, raised her hand and said, do you still spank them or whip them? And they said, yes, we do. They broke our laws. So they weren't really going to back down from their laws. But they clearly were not thinking about climate change. However, after that event, the State Department official who was sitting in the back, I don't know if we have any here today, but the State Department official who was sitting in the back, who was officially the sponsor, came up to me afterwards. Remember, this is like the first time I've really gone public with this topic, talking about it. Says, leans into me, whispers into my ear, is it true that we're going to have 1 billion climate refugees, billion with a B, by 2050? And he looked scared. He truly looked worried. Like, I just got back from DC 2 weeks ago, and they're saying, that there could be 1 billion climate refugees. And then this is the first time I had ever heard of this. So I said, this is kind of the pivotal point that launched me on my current agenda right now. Well, the important thing is not whether there will be 1 billion climate refugees by 2050. Is it plausible? Well, maybe. There are 100 million Chinese migrants moved internally to the coast in about 10 years. Is it possible? Well, maybe, but the important thing is that you believe it. That you believe that there's 1 billion climate refugees. And that was my aha moment, on the spot right there, that I realized that the important thing is not whether there will be or are something called a climate refugee, and there will be groups that will claim there will never be climate refugees, or they're not, simply because they don't exist in the law. And of course, the flip side of that is once we make them exist in the law, then they exist. But the important thing is the fact that the State Department and others, and since then, I have done the research on this now and looked into it. The military, the Pentagon, puts avoiding the social impacts of climate change number 2 after avoiding war with China in terms of their scenario planning. Now, what this led me into was, as I delved more into this issue of climate refugees, is that we're now fully in the area of just scenarios. We can't make predictions, we can't make projections. The data trends don't go out. All the natural scientists are kind of freaking out. Everyone's sort of freaking out, saying, it's the end of data. Instead of the end of history, we have the end of data. And I thought, wow, well, this is time to bring in the sociological imagination and my sensitivity, these past things. And I'll end with this final note that we can maybe have time to discuss, which is the sociological imagination is a bait and switch, and that we talk about things like that or the social construction of reality, but there's almost no research agenda on the imagination by social scientists. And I think that that's part of our problem, in that all the things we're talking about are imagined. The state, institutions, you name it. It's kind of, is it a mirror? What is it? It is a kind of strange thing, in that we are invoking the imagination left and right, and yet we know more about our digestive tracts right now than we know about the imagination. I think I'll end on that note.
David Wrathall now to end our panel, and then we'll hopefully have a little time for discussion. David comes to us from the Environmental Studies Department here at UCSC as well.
Let's get started. So I showed up with 8 minutes ready to talk for 8 minutes, and in the course of the morning, I expanded that to 20 minutes, and now you're going to see me edit it back down to 8 minutes in the duration of my remarks here. I originally intended to speak on the issue of resettlement, and specifically resettlement that stems from climate change impacts. But 2 weeks ago, I was handed this amazing and relevant topic that really fits with this session. It's the concept of loss and damages. It's language that's being introduced to the UNFCCC. As we speak, in the next round of meetings in Doha, they'll be negotiating and voting on what loss and damages is. And so I just got back from Bonn, Germany, where negotiations were taking place over this language. And I was part of a group of academics who were invited to critique and try to foresee some of the challenges that we might have with this concept of loss and damages. So they locked us in a room for a few days and helped us and asked us to sort of comment. And so I'm going to be reflecting a little bit on that experience. But the argument I want to make is that in the international policy framework, we've got an international situation in which that very much favors resettlement as a policy alternative. And we've also, on the other hand, we have a whole set of resettlements, different types of resettlements that are being practiced and used in unprecedented sort of ways. And so we have this spectacular confluence of an international policy framework and practice. And so the fear is that what we're going to see is an outcome of undesirable development scenarios from this. Okay, so to put this in perspective, loss and damages is a pretty major addition. The UNFCCC started, the convention was signed in 1992. In 1997, we decided that if we're going to mitigate some of the negative effects of climate change, we're going to have to stabilize carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and so mitigation was born. As time goes on, the international community realizes we're not going to be able to mitigate climate change, we're going to have to adapt in order to buffer the adverse effects of climate change to maintain the status quo. And so here we are in 2012, and we've got this new language. And what it means is, geez, we're not even going to be able to adapt. We're going to have to account for the adverse effects of climate change that people experiences. And so that's the language that's being decided right now. So what does loss and damages mean? It's an insurance tool. It's a legal concept that has been applied in some contexts of environmental stress by governments and insurance companies as a way of safeguarding assets, assigning responsibility for impacts and recouping investments, where hazards can be clearly demarcated. We can think about a flood. Who caused it? What was damaged? Who pays? And how much? And so in climate change, what we're talking about here is the destruction of livelihoods and places being rendered uninhabitable or less livable in any case. And so that's the type of loss and damages we're talking about. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about what this concept means by critiquing it. I'm trying to critique it before it's even out of the gate. So first of all, climate change represents stress that is cumulative and compounding, incremental, unstable and dynamic. It is extremely problematic, establishing starting points and endpoints when we're talking about climate change. It's an ongoing process, and the physical impacts may set off a cascading set of social impacts. And so to use a disaster recovery tool that deals with discrete events is fundamentally inadequate because of the temporal, spatial, and social scale of climate change. Okay, so secondly, even when we can conduct an assessment of loss and damages, there are a number of methodological issues. Loss and damage is about measuring stocks and flows, things that are damaged. It's a tool about quantifying the life, the life that we experience. And so in that sense, it's essentially about economic knowledge. And so basically the idea is with loss and damages, we want to take this complex set of relationships of which life is composed, write a check, hand it over, and that's what you get. And that's inadequate. Thirdly, climate change stress reveals itself in crises that merely reveal a latent social condition. The historical nature of social vulnerability is that certain countries or peoples had already experienced loss, and they'd already experienced damage to begin with. And since damage and loss is concerned with restoring, why would we want to take people back to the state that they before climate change? So the last concern is about what happens when the concept enters discourse and then takes life in practice. And as budgets kind of emerge and mission statements are formed, and then we start to envision programs and implement those programs on the ground. In my argument here, I'll just summarize it. The problem is that we've got a tool that deals with this elephant in the room about liability and compensation. But the tool is an insurance technique, and so it really undoes the true purpose of compensating people for the loss and damages that they've experienced. I don't know if that makes any sense. But it basically gets the people who are emitting carbon off the hook for what they've done. And so as I'm sitting in the room with my collaborators in Bonn, there are several of us who work on the issue of resettlement. And what we're saying to each other is, holy smokes, this is about resettlement. This whole thing is code for resettlement. How are we going to compensate people for the livelihoods that they've lost? Pretty remarkable. Let's see, where am I going with this? I'm trying to edit here as I go through this. Resettlement is a large-scale development tool that's been practiced. It's really in the days of colonialism and post-colonialism. It really took off, and with the sort of large-scale development projects that we think of, irrigation projects and dam building. And during the course of the 20th century, upwards of 70 million people were resettled for these development programs. And the World Bank was behind a lot of those. And so in the course of this experience, the World Bank accumulated a huge amount of data on resettlement and what it means and what it entails and what it does to social systems. And I'm just going to run through some of the things that we learned. By 2000, Michael Chernea kind of synthesized some of this stuff. And he came up with this incredibly powerful set of critiques about resettlement. And I'm just going to go through this very, very briefly. That when we resettle people, they lose land, they lose employment, they lose shelter, they're marginalized, they experience increased morbidity and mortality, greater food insecurity, a loss of access to common property services, and social disarticulation. In addition, other factors have been identified, including psychological disorders and anomic behaviors like robbery and violence. So this is what happens to a community that you resettle. When you sever all of the ties that make up a community, when you lift a community up and set them down somewhere else, you essentially disturb every aspect of social life. And that's called a totalizing phenomenon. Resettlements have been described as a secondary disaster. They've been conceived as rural slums or economic dead zones. And as Anthony Oliver Smith said, resettlement management is the graveyard of careers. So anyone who ventures into this project is doomed to see some pretty horrible things. And that's my personal experience with resettlement is looking at post-disaster reconstruction resettlement. And I would concur with Scudder, who said that resettlement should never be undertaken if it can be avoided. And yet we're moving to this place where resettlement is increasingly favorably seen. Are we really down to 2 minutes? Okay. Let's see here. So resettlement's it's been used in development projects throughout the 20th century. But it's increasingly being used in different models for disaster reconstruction. The worrying thing is that now adaptation projects are really starting to take off. We're seeing resettlement being implemented in those contexts as well. And so, we've been talking a little bit about this. Ashwini mentioned one case, and there are numerous. We were just at the Land Grabs Conference, and resettlement is now part of the discourse. This is what we talk about, people being resettled. And so climate change, I guess what I'm saying is it's fueling, there's a narrative about resettlement all wrapped up in it. And that's extremely problematic. Okay, so I'm just going to conclude. I think this is a dangerous confluence that we're seeing. This international policy atmosphere and this tool that's being applied in all sorts of different ways. Essentially the language of loss and damages, the essential fear is that if we allow people to simply write a check for the damages that people suffer, hand it over, then people will get off the hook. Off the hook for structural inequities of the past, but also the secondary disaster of resettlement. And so this is a way of dealing with climate injustice in one single blow. And so you're always supposed to end on a positive. Environmental stress is motivating population flows. Places are becoming less inhabitable and less productive. With sea level rise, we can imagine more. So resettlement is an attempt to artificially freeze population dynamics, but population dynamics might be part of the solution. Mobility offers opportunities for transformation. So we can think creatively about how that would go. During the long process of displacement and resettlement, as we see it coming, displaced people might consider resettlement as one mobility alternative among many. And so resettlement could be a lure or an incentive that displaced persons either accept or often resist. Oftentimes, displaced persons have the opportunity to ask themselves, should I accept resettlement or can I manage on my own? And this already occurs. This widely occurs in resettlement. This is an observed outcome in resettlement research. And so as we have population dynamics acting on a resettlement, let's say people who can manage on their own are moving away and people who can't are staying behind, this is how we end up with poverty traps, or these rural ghettos, or the economic dead zones. But resettlement policy can also be aimed at breaking the destructive cycle of impoverishment and marginalization, instead of restoring some hope that children will be better off than their parents. So resettlement could span over 2 or 3 generations, perhaps. People don't have to be uprooted. They can be encouraged to settle in safer areas from the start. They can be provided with new job opportunities and new places to settle that would allow for relocation to happen on their own terms. And lastly, resettlement doesn't necessarily have to be imposed, but can be a choice that people make on their own. And I'll just leave it right there.
We'll take 2-3 questions, and then we'll have the last, the closing session. So faces hand door.
Yeah, this is a question for Professor Adam. So I really appreciated hearing some of how you've gotten to where you are. It was great background, and now I want to hear what the project is. Sort of
I was hoping someone would ask.
You led up to it. And,
Well, the title of the project, what's in the title, what's the name? But it's called Imaginations, Institutions, and Transformations. And we have a Reimagining Human Rights Mini Conference in August in New York City. I think it's August 16th. And we're really kind of examining, my collaborators, John Dale, who's at George Mason, we're really kind of examining, starting with human rights, because when where this all leads up to is kind of the politics of rights making, rights claims, justice, things like that. I think that what we're trying to view is two things, going backwards and kind of looking forward. One, reconstructing the career of the imagination and the history of social thought in the imagination, which is absolutely fascinating. If anyone wants a great overview on the imagination, read Eva Brand, B-R-A-N-N. It's an encyclopedia, 800-page, up and down of the imagination, and it's truly amazing. If anyone sends me their email address, I'll also send you a link to a Prezi presentation on the timeline of Brand. That's Prezi's like an alternative PowerPoint. So we're kind of reconstructing that and talking about that in terms, including the philosophical foundations of the social sciences and what happened to the mind and consciousness, especially in sociology, but also in social sciences beyond. When did we drop the mind? By the time we get to postmodernism, there's no imagination, there's no actual subject that can imagine. We have imaginaries, and we have alternative globalizations, but we don't have actually imagining. And so one part is reconstructing the range of the imagination. The other part is how do we bring this into human rights making, including asking the question, what is a human? What is a person? And so there's a great book by Christian Smith by the name, What is a Person? But I'm really drawing on the work of Cornelius Castoriadis, Umberto Unger, Hans Joas, among some people that I would recommend in terms of looking at creativity and the role of the imagination in power dynamics. And not simply in a superficial, oh, we all need to be creative, but actually the dark side of the imagination as well. That's my kind of interest. So given all those topics I mentioned, it's kind of like, how do we bring in the dark side of this? Including the multi-billion-dollar industry that is solely focused on your imaginations.
Justin? Yeah, I had a question for Dave. Could you, could you elaborate more on how, I can imagine the popular discourse around this is that, hey, look, here's this mechanism now that people can actually recover, whereas maybe there's nothing but the legal system already to actually people who are being resettled to actually recover some compensation. So are there things in this new proposed rule that say that they don't have legal rights anymore to sue, or like, what kind of compensation can they get now that by having this on the books actually undermines their ability to?
Well, so this is based on loss of damages as it's conceived, as it's practiced in insurance. And so yeah, when loss of damage is quantified and when it's compensated, when we assign compensation liability, it's over. And so I don't know. I mean, it's still being negotiated right now, and we don't know how it's going to shake out. These are the critiques that we're saying that's not a solution because climate change is dynamic. It's ongoing. When does it end? When does climate change end? So how can you talk about damages as they're unfolding? Yeah, I guess watch for it. Yeah.
We'll take one last question.
So a comment and a question for David, Kyle, and Kathy. See, all the presentations were great. The thing about the imagination and the institutional questions that are present in all of this. As part of this, the issue with the obsession with the economical rational actor and the obsession with private administration around private goods. And this is why I want to ask Kathy a question in terms of the issue with PES as the most famous PES program in the world. Costa Rica isn't actually a market; it's based on a tax, and somehow that's all been forgotten in this obsession, current policy obsession. And so the question is if you're worried, if you're thinking about ecological, trying to insert some kind of localized benefit into this whole mess. What are you doing? Where's the institutional reconception of this thing? Because it seems to me that a lot of these things are public or common goods, and that's something that is often being overlooked. Extension is something that no one really talks about in policy related to rural development anymore, or it's not in fashion at least. Is that part of this, or is that one way of relating to this thing? Because you're mentioning.
You're asking me? Or
Yes, I'm asking you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think, I guess the imagination part of it, I think the key to that is the different imaginaries of the problem being people versus nature, as opposed to the problem being some people versus nature perhaps, but arguably the majority of people being either presently or potentially capable of living in a positive relationship to nature. In the case of some of the PES projects in Mexico that I studied and wrote about, there's an article in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers that I co-authored about the study about the national PES program in Mexico. And some of the rural peasant movements, the activist rural social movements insisted on redefining the goals of the program to include the production of food, the right to stay, to not migrate, to insist on recognition of the positive roles, both in terms of survival and production and culture, but also in terms of ecosystems, including carbon capture and storage, of peasant agriculture and community forestry. And around the world, there are a lot of examples of sometimes, municipal governments, but usually locally organized communities trying to kind of redefine PES or redefine RED in ways that would build on what they're already doing or what they want to do. I mean, they have their own reasons for wanting to stay there. They have their own reasons for wanting their children to be able to see trees. So I think there's a lot of that possibility. In the Mexican case, they were able to persuade some of the Mexican state authorities, and because the state is all over the place. I mean, the state is a complex monster, and there are a lot of different trends and priorities. But they were able to persuade some of the agencies in the state to support that point of view. But then the World Bank, in evaluating the project, said, oh, well, we're creating inefficiencies here, which means we're going to waste conservation money. It's a scarce thing. There won't be enough of it. So, and that's the other part about relating to the imagination, is breaking with this notion, this assumption of scarcity, and starting to think in terms of abundance and plenitude, because we have too much. I mean, there's a lot of food in the world. There's almost too much of everything. There's plenty of everything. Water is badly distributed, but we're not. The problem the world is facing is not a scarcity of resources; it's horrible distribution of resources.
I guess I would just say that's absolutely where we're going on our empirical project. It's a comparison with 4 research sites. It's really looking at the brokers who are setting themselves up as the brokers between the funders and the local beneficiaries of social investment along a range of issues. Acumen Fund, even Kiva, and others are setting themselves up as, we're going to make sure that these investments pay off. And I think it's part of a global trend of measured creativity, in which we're all efficiency experts now. We all kind of speak the language, even when we come up for merit review in the UC system, especially. We all have to prove everything is assigned a score and quantified and all that. I think it's been so infused into a kind of rational actor that's been projected on us, that's been imagined onto us, that it's really hard to break out of unless you actually turn it around and look at the imagination itself. A rational algorithm can't really process an imaginative subject or actor, but an imaginative actor or imaginative analysis can easily assign rationality to the subjects. In fact, that makes that quite easy. And think of how we kind of adapt that. And so it can only kind of go one way, not the other.
But why are you imagining that something good depends on investments from somewhere outside?
I'm not.
Oh, you're not. Okay.
No,
Well, a lot of people are.
No, we're looking at precisely the brokers who are setting themselves up.
Okay.
In fact, it's the other way around. We're looking at democratizing humor, how not just the West to the rest, but the other way around, how do values and concepts flow back the other way.
Okay.
Let's thank the speakers again. If you need a break, take 1 or 2 minutes. We're going to get the the final panel together down here, and